and welcome to CS264 Software Design. This is Lecture 4 and this is Lesson 1. In this short lesson we're going to look at some of the programming fundamentals associated with C#, and in particular we're going to look at the keywords using and var. You'll see in your programs that I've given you, and also in programs online, also to demo programs, if you look at the Microsoft documentation, you'll see that the words using and var come up very frequently. So let's see what's happening with these, why they're used, how they're used, and understanding how they're used. So the first one we're going to look at is the using keyword. And you'll have seen this already in your demo programs, as I mentioned. We use it to import namespaces and types. So we use this form using system at the top of our programs. This form of using is called the directive form. That's where it's used to import namespaces. But as a directive, using can also be used to create aliases and namespaces and types. So Microsoft gave us a great description and understanding, really, of the three forms or three uses of using. The first is the using statement, which defines the scope at the end of which an object would be disposed. The second is the using directive, which creates an alias for a namespace or imports types defined in other namespaces. And finally, or thirdly, the using static directive that imports the members of a class. So when it's used as a statement, the using keyword can be used to create a scope and define the scope and then dispose of objects when that scope is finished. So what happens is that we create objects, we reuse objects, we create strings, all of these things. So when we're finished with them, the garbage collector associated with the runtime environment will be managing all this and release them when possible. So the using statement helps with that garbage collection. So the documentation tells us that in detail that the common language runtime automatically releases the memory used to store objects that are no longer required. So we can work through this and look at the documentation, see this for yourself. Let's have an example, that's probably best. We'll use an example for each tree. So the first thing we're going to look at is the using static directive. So when you call a static member, you provide a type name along with the member name. So math.py, for example. So, if you're repeatedly using this in mathematical computation and so forth, then, having to do this all the time and invoke members of the type, that can have really verbose or obscure code. So we can actually use the using directive to access the static members directly. So we say using static system.console, using static system.math, and that program, in our programs, then we don't actually have to write system.console.writeline. We can just use writeline. Same with, we don't have to write system.math.sqrt. We can just use sqrt, and that allows us to be able to run and access these. So that's the first type. Now let's look at an example where we have the using statement that defines a scope. So we know already that that form creates a scope for garbage collection of iDisposable objects, and iDisposable objects are just objects that provide a dispose method, so it allows them to be released. So we can use a form called using and then set up a block, okay, in place of try a block finally, and then dispose of resources here afterwards. So it's a nice way to do this. So here's a slightly updated version that you'll see in the Microsoft documentation. So I'm creating a string, a verbatim string with some lines here. A second one, okay, one is called many lines and one is called more lines. Then I'm using var reader new string reader many lines, and what that does is it creates a way to actually access these lines one by one. Okay, but we have the using in front of it, so it tells us that when we're finished with reader, then it can be disposed, or we mark it for disposal. So we have create a string here, then we iterate over the string using the string reader. Okay, and then so while a line is available, we are able to write that line to the console. So we can generate it. We can show you how you can generate an error here by trying to access the reader string after it's been disposed or after it becomes unavailable, and we can have a look at that in our code. So let's switch over to code here. So I have the program running here, and it's available for you as a demo to download. I'm going to run this. We should get a little message telling us that, that we haven't used one of the variables more lines in this case here. So it's, yeah, not surprising. I've set it up for a little bit later, and you can see that it writes the detail. Now let's have a look and see if we can access this reader again after it's been marked for disposal here. So we can already see that there's some error here, but we'll do it and run it anyway. Okay, so we cannot assign to reader because it's a using variable. So that's understandable, and that's nicely informed. So we'll just get rid of that again. Okay, so that's how we work with this directive. Now we can do a much better thing. So the reader, really what's happening is the reader was disposed of at the end of the block or the scope. You can actually combine multiple declarations of the same type with using, as shown in this program here. You cannot use implicitly typed variables var, and we'll see that later in the lesson when you declare multiple variables in a single statement. Again, we see about that. So that's why it's slightly different. Okay, so let's copy all of this. Okay, I've copied all of this. Let's just select all here, replace it, save it, run it. And what's happening here is we have this time we have a series of letters called my letters. On different lines, we have a set of numbers. We're creating a reader here, which just reads all the letters and outputs all the letters to the display, which we've done. That's fine here. Now we go to generate we could generate a syntactic error, but again, if we did by using the trying to access the reader again or set it up again. So now we're going to use one to set up a num reader. Okay, that reads the set of numbers. Okay, so we have those, and we display this. That's expected. So that's just a repeat. Now we're going to do both simultaneously. So we set up a reader. So using, again, this is our form we're interested in, using string reader, the letters allows us to read letters. Our numbers reads the numbers. And here we just created var num reader because it was an implicit type, and then it will have the same type of string reader here. But here, when we're using multiple instances of variables, we have to explicitly say what type they are. Okay, so we have a string reader for the numbers, a string reader for the letters, and they iterate over, and we write the output of each to the display. And this is what we get here. Notice that at the end, we're going to get this extra line here, and you can figure out why we do that and how you might fix it. So that's how we can use using that allows us to create a scope and then marks the objects for disposal after we're finished. Okay, so we can also use the using in a form where it's an alias directive. So let's have a look here at this. So here I have an interesting setup here where we're using to create an alias for a namespace. So here's a hello world program. Let's copy it and run it first and verify for ourselves that it creates a hello world. So it executes fine, and we get hello world, which is what we would expect. Now this is a complicated way to just give an example. So what's happening here is we have our original namespace called myUsing. So now we're defining an alias for some nested namespace. So the nested namespace will be myUsing.namespace, and you'll see that here's our outer block, our namespace, and in here we have a nested namespace called myNamespace, and within that we have a class called myClass, and that just has a single message that has a single class member called message, and that prints or has the word hello world. It's just a string. So we're creating an alias to this though called program class myUsing.namespace. So here we have another class called example, and in here then we're actually using this alias to be able to refer to class in this namespace down here, and then we can create an example object or a sample object from this myExample class later, as we do here, myExample me, as a new example, and we're just calling that method, which is here, and that method uses the alias to call the class in here, and extract a string and write the string to display. Okay, it's overly complicated, but actually what's important really here is that we're able to create an alias using, and we do that here. We define an alias. So that's the third form, and it's straightforward. Finally, I'd like to talk about the var keyword. So you saw me use it earlier in this lesson, and in other programs you'll see. And what it is an implicit type declaration. Microsoft tells us that variables are declared at method scope and can have an implicit type var. Okay, an implicitly typed local variable is strongly typed, just as if you declared the type yourself, but the compiler determines the type. So you're giving the compiler more work actually to do. And there are places where you need to actually have it as an implicit variable. But these two declarations will be identical. Var x assigned value of 100 and int x assigned value of 100 because it's one's implicitly and one's explicitly typed. Okay, so common uses with constructor invocation expressions, and var allows you so that you don't have to repeat a type name in a variable declaration and an object instantiation. So, for example, you can say var MC is a new program class that my class, we saw that earlier, and here we didn't have to say what the type of the class was here, like my class. So implicitly typed variables must be initialized. You can't write var x, for example, on its own. You have to actually give it a value so that the type can be determined by the compiler. You can't declare variables in a single statement. So you can't say var I1, ji2, and so forth, all that kind of stuff. You can't do this. Var can be used in loops because it's implicit again, var I instead of int I. So you use var when you're not sure what the type of data will be stored in a variable. So you use var to store this, for example, when you deal with anonymous type. So here's a record, an anonymous type here. So var record is a new, and we're essentially creating something that looks like a bit of JSON here. So then we're able to write out the details and see it will work. But we don't have, like this one doesn't have a type, really, this class. We may cast it to a type later, but this is the way we would actually use var, clearly, and you can see when we need it. So use var carefully. Don't use for simple local variables or types that you know, but do check the documentation about the restrictions on using implicit types. Here's some references to the using and to var. And really that's it. We learned a little bit about using and var keywords in C# programming. Thank you very much for watching.